Oh, you want me to put the pedal foot down?
It took a long time.
It's very nice. I really do like it. In fact, I'm gonna yeah.
Can you hear us back there? Yes? Okay, great. Well, I want to welcome everybody to our panel. Our panel is, as you can see, a little bit of feedback. It's called Turning the Tide of Corruption, and we're going to be focusing specifically on Mexico and Guatemala. And these are our hashtags. Feel free to use any of them, or all of them. What feedback is that? Yeah, we're getting a little bit of feedback. Can we? Yeah, do you want me to just finish? Okay. So just kind of give you a sense of the format. One of the things that we wanted to emphasize in our panel was to have more of a discussion, and so we're going to talk for 30 minutes, about 5 to 6 minutes each, and then we're going to leave half an hour for questions. So please make sure to write down your questions, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. My name is Cara Andrade. I am a PhD student at the American University in Washington, D.C., and my focus is on media technology and social change. And I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of a story and background behind the idea for this panel. It came from some of the research that I did last semester, mostly in the summer of 2015, and I was doing some work for my dissertation, just kind of surfing around for different ideas, and I applied for a grant with the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and I ended up doing a lot of research specifically focused on media and technology being used in Guatemala and Mexico, and that were focused just different digital technologies and what we call ICTs, or information and communication technologies, like mobile technologies that and technologies that go online, that specifically were being used for increasing accountability, transparency, and self-governance functions. And so one of the things that I found is that there were a lot of really innovative ways that these digital technologies were being used, and some of them very positive. And so you can see some of the images that it's just a lot of people are starting to use them because, especially with mobile, they're starting to be very ubiquitous. But there's also a dark side to the use of these technologies. Like, for example, this picture of John for He had tweeted out his opinion about the bank, and he had actually been arrested for tweeting that out in Guatemala. There's also been very specific targeting of citizen journalists. One example is the murder of Maria Elizabeth Macias, a citizen journalist. Well, she was a professional crime reporter, but there are other examples that are citizen journalists who are tweeting and using Twitter specifically to just talk about what's happening in their neighborhood, to denounce different crimes and things that are happening. And so she actually, in 2011, when she was doing this, she was found decapitated in Nuevo Laredo. And next to her decapitated body was that sign that you see explaining why she was killed, specifically for her activities online. And so our panel is going to focus both on the positive side of the use of technology for self-governance, accountability, and increase of transparency and activities around transparency. But we're also going to look at the other side, right? Also the increased risks that it presents to citizens, and look at different holistic solutions that address the different risks that these technologies actually present to citizens, and then we'll take some questions around that. I want to start with an example that will give you more of a sense of what is actually happening on the ground. One of my sources was Miguel Angel Jimenez, and he's a community activist and a political activist as well, who is working with the community police in Mexico. And so I did a ride-along with him for 15 hours, and I interviewed him several times over the cell phone, in person, in different ways. And so I want to show a video of him in a minute, but one of the things that was to me, just drove it home is every time we spoke, I said, well, you say that a lot of your conversation, a lot of what you do is being watched, or there's surveillance, like you're always being watched. And when I was talking to him, he said, everything we're talking about is being recorded. The government has my phone number, and for all of us who are organizing, we're being watched day and night. And so I asked him, said, are you actually exaggerating? He said, no, this is actually the way we do our work here in Mexico. And he was the founder of an organization, a group on WhatsApp called Fuente Informativa, which in English translates to informative source. And these are some of WhatsApp allows you to form a group chat. And so this is, for example, one of the group chats that they had. And here's the video that I produced from my drive along with him.
Me toca barrer los más feos, levantar los perros muertos y toda esa pendejada. Me intentaron matar varias veces de 2 pisos.
Miguel Angel Jimenez Blanco was a political activist and an organizer of the community police forces in Mexico. For this, many wanted him dead. Through the community police forces, Miguel Angel wanted to wake the towns up with arms, stop the robbing, the rampant killing, the drug-related violence, and the corruption, which had infiltrated the local and national public processes and institutions. When 43 students were disappeared from a public rural teachers' college in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, Miguel Angel was one of the first to tell the rest of the world of the disappearances. He used a WhatsApp group called Fuente Informativa to upload first-hand reports from Guerrero to a group of mostly international journalists.
Los que estamos en esto, comprometidos, sabemos que nuestra vida no vale nada para nuestro gobierno. Los moderados nos van a levantar. Y los ataques por eso tenemos que aprovechar al máximo la comunicación.
During Mexico's contentious elections, Miguel Angel collected voters' testimonies of alleged vote buying and coercion in San Marcos, Guerrero on June 13, 2015.
Estaba dando dinero.
Sí, le daban 200 pesos por voto.
Por voto. Pero ¿cómo fue? O sea, ¿cómo es que le daba dinero?
Bueno, a cambio del voto.
¿Votaba primero o le daba primero dinero?
No, primero le daba dinero.
Fueron a votar.
Primero votando, la estaba leyendo que fueron a votar.
I followed him along with this. Miguel Angel recorded testimonies with his cell phone and uploaded them to WhatsApp. Later, he told me they would be presented as evidence to declare votes in these towns illegitimate. He knows he's made enemies along the way, but it goes with the work.
organizara, que me gustaría. Que la gente se organizara, que la gente entrara en comunión pueblo con pueblo. ¿Me entiendes? Que luchen. Es todo lo que espero de ellos.
On August 8th, Miguel Angel's bullet-ridden body was found at the entrance to his hometown, Jaltianguis, along the road to Acapulco, Mexico. He was 45 years old.
Okay, so that's, hopefully that gives you a little bit more of a sense of what people are dealing with on the ground. And I want to just pass it, kind of stay with the Mexico example, and then you can take it away.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to introduce myself briefly, then spend a minute or two talking about how we got into the issue of whistleblowing and investigative journalism in Latin America, and talk specifically about the role of Mexico Leaks, news and whistleblowing platform that yesterday just completed 1 year old. So my name is Benjamin Cocolet. I'm the executive director and founder of Polar. We're a Latin American-wide NGO focused on corporate accountability, transparency, and human rights issues. We have 4 major programs. I'll only talk about one today. It's a program focused on transparency, technology, and citizen journalism, where we both create technological solutions as well as work with journalists to basically do strategic corporate research on corporations, their role in acts of corruption, and of course, when that issue results in human rights abuses. My personal story with whistleblowing began the opposite of how it ended, which is myself, I was a whistleblower. I was a whistleblower in a case in 2004 involving a person in Mexico that they called the King of Denim. It was a owner of a series of garment maquila plants, which was found to have used quote-unquote legitimate businesses for purposes of child sex, pornography, and human trafficking. We had done a lot of the research on this corporation, the publicly traded company on Wall Street through which the corporation operated, as well as some different actors in government. And when the story came out, I was one of the people that broke the news around who were some of the people involved in the case, helping journalists at the time uncover the web of people with inside this corporation. And I did so in a way that, together with other whistleblowers and other journalists, led to a Supreme Court case in Mexico where they found a sitting governor, an ex-governor, and a leader of Congress with their hands in the cookie jar, literally participating in trading bottles of alcohol for child sex and pornography for parties of elected officials and corporate elites in Mexico. And so at the time, I was quite ignorant about what the value of whistleblowing was, but it was one of the first times in my life where, based on good, hard research, we were able to get significant amount of information out there into public existence, and that led to significant cases and really to a lot of work around understanding the kind of network around human trafficking in Mexico, specifically as related to, once again, the political and economic elite. So when I myself began to kind of integrate my experience with what was happening in the world, was with Julian Assange, then Edward Snowden, then James Risen, most recently the Swiss leaks case, where we began to see others coming forward, whether it's whistleblowers or journalism organizations protecting and facilitating their whistleblowing activity. And then recently, as an NGO, we've done quite a bit of work doing strategic corporate research, where essentially the phenomenon that we're looking at is the phenomenon of state capture and crony capitalism, right? This is something that's defined as the way that economic power, whether legitimate or illicit capital, is able to capture the legislative, executive, or judicial functions of a state and do so in a way that benefits the private interest. So in doing this work, we realized that we were getting whistleblowers coming to us, blowing the whistle on different corporations who were participating in this type of activity, but per se, we were using, honestly, the information we got for private accountability. It was people coming to us individually. We were doing individual accountability actions with corporations and governments. We weren't producing public information at the time around what the nature was of the corruption. So while we were locally and privately successful, the public wasn't aware of what was happening. We realized it wasn't obviously a scalable way of shining the light on corruption, and as the name of this panel says, turning the tide on corruption. So what we essentially did was, in the next slide, I talk about the black box. The black box is not us, the black box is the black box of a corporation in this case, where you see it, you know it's there, but you don't have access to people on the inside to know what are those private decisions that are being made, what are some of the banking secrets that they might have, what are some of the favors that they might be incurring or culling with folks in the public sector. And so what we tried to do through those three mechanisms, Quienes Can Wiki, Mexico Leaks, and rendecuentas.org, is create ways to basically foment whistleblowing by corporate actors inside the black box of corporations, but also inside the black box of governments, to come forward and reveal information. So, like I said, yesterday, this organization, Mexico Leaks, completed a year old. This is essentially an organization made up of 3 NGOs, 3 traditional media organizations, and 1 collective of journalists in Mexico. We basically have an alliance whereby all 7 of us decide how we are going to receive the leaks that come to us using secure encryption technology. For example, for the whistleblower, they use a Tor-based system running global leak software with PGP encryption. And for those of us, the receptor organizations, be it traditional journalism organizations or NGOs doing journalism, we use a Tails system also with PGP encryption that facilitates our ability to read those encrypted leaks that come our way. When we launched the site, it was launched once again a year ago, right away, one of the major companies that whose journalist was participating, this woman named Carmen Aristegui, perhaps Mexico's most well-known journalist, she was fired by her employer several days after joining Mexico Leaks. And the reason was clearly that the government and the company that employed her at the time, MVS Communications, had an interest in not allowing whistleblowers to come forward. So they did probably the worst possible thing they could have done in firing her, which is within weeks we had 117,000 Twitter followers. We had a significant amount of international public attention, both in Mexico as well as the New York Times, CNN, and a lot of other outlets that were covering the issue of Mexico Leaks in Mexico. And basically it's been this positive snowball effect ever since of first tens, then hundreds, and now several hundreds of leaks that have come in over the last year that have led to some really successful stories in the country. This is an example of the site. You can check it there if you want. That's the portal where people can go in and participate in actually leaking the information. That takes you to a separate Tor system from where you can leak in an anonymous and secure way. And these are just 2 of many of the stories that come out the last year. The one in the upper left is one of the partners, Animal Politico, did it, which is something that just came out this past Tuesday, where they found that one of Mexico's oldest archaeological sites for the last 30 years had been tweaking the archaeological permissions that were preventing a big shopping mall from being built. And just recently, all of the last provisions that were left protecting the archaeological remains and the ancient burial ground underneath the site were put on the shelf, and 2 of Mexico's richest men were able to go ahead with the permissions to build a big shopping mall there. It might sound small in the context, perhaps, of the United States. In Mexico is a huge deal because the person who gave the permissions in the first place to, most recently, to actually start this escalade of eliminating the permissions for the archaeological sites and giving the construction permissions is the sitting president of Mexico. When he was the governor of Mexico, he started this process, and really it's been a snowball effect ever since, of allowing this mall to be built. On the bottom right, this is something that we produced a couple months ago. It's about Mexico's Infonavit system. This is a public housing benefit that people receive as a result of their employers that allows them to receive a credit to buy housing on the cheap. And what that is, essentially, it's a system whereby there's a pool of money, kind of like Social Security in the United States, and a whistleblower came forward and said, look, that information that the Housing Authority is investing our housing fund for all of us as Mexicans to buy housing has been invested in the system, where 80% of it was spent on risky stock market trades that actually lost money for the workers whose investment had existed, and the other 20% went to friends of the director of the agency who put together a tens of millions of dollar technology database, basically, to store people's private information. And that was done, the most recent estimate said 87% above the going market rate to build that kind of database. So these stories have led to, in the case of Infonavit, the one we broke, they changed the leader of the agency. They now have someone in place who supposedly is working on transparentizing the system that we exposed. And then the one on the top left, for example, this is an ongoing story. It was just broken on Tuesday, but so far El País and CNN outside of Mexico have taken it up this week. So we hope that's also going to have a snowball effect. And I'll finish simply by saying that our last major push in all of this, not only is to have Mexico leaks exist, but exist in a way that pushes also the Mexican government to create secure and anonymous whistleblowing systems, both at the stock exchange level for those inside the black box of corporations in Mexico. So there's actually government protection and economic benefits for whistleblowers to come forward, kind of like the SEC's whistleblower office in the United States. Plus, we're looking at creating systems whereby government employees inside Mexican agencies can also blow the whistle in a secure, anonymous way. Currently in Mexico, there's no whistleblowing legislation whatsoever, so Mexico Leaks exists, A, because it's a good example of citizen journalism, but B, because we want to push the government to do what really should have been done anyway, which is protect whistleblowers. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Enrique Naveda. I'm the editor of Plaza Pública, a Guatemalan online newspaper. Is that okay? A Guatemalan in-depth online newspaper, the first one. It is based at a university, Universidad Rafael Landívar. It belongs to the university. And we were, back in 2011, the first, the smallest and the newest outlet in getting the WikiLeaks, so we've also worked with whistleblowing, even though it's something that we don't do quite often. If you go to Guatemala and ask if corruption is a priority in our work, people might tell you that it isn't, and they will be right. Why is that? Because we don't fight corruption as commonly understood in Guatemala. In Guatemala, corruption is understood as a petty crime or big crime committed against the state's treasury, mainly by public officials, public servants, or the new rich, the emerging companies. And that's only half of the story. And that's the story that the bigger companies, the traditional companies, have been developing and have been spreading all around their media and public discourse. So it's true, we don't fight corruption as commonly understood, and yet we do fight corruption as a priority if you look at more deeply. We do it by trying to signify or re-signify it as a systemic distortion of public institutions in order to provide benefit to the private sector. Not only to the emerging private sector, but also to the traditional private sector. But I want to underscore the idea that it's a systemic distortion. It includes the law, it includes the constitution, it includes practice. So that's how we practically fight corruption in Guatemala. How we do that today? Well, we are not activists, so we don't do activism. We are not lobbyists, so we don't lobby. We are investigative journalists. We've been that for 5 years. So we investigate and provide context. That context might reach 10 weeks ago, or 10 years ago, or 500 years back to the colonial times, or the colonization. Our main goal in Plaza Pública is help nurturing active and critical citizenship. And we do that using diverse techniques, diverse tools, and various conceptual innovations. We are not so interested in technological innovations, although we use it and we innovate, but in our context, I think we provide mostly conceptual innovations. So we use the tools of data journalism. We have done big data analysis, we crunch information, we develop news apps, and we also use transparency tools. We do as well, of course, traditional in-depth investigative journalism. We have an offline line of work. We organize discussion panels. We teach at university. We have an educational program for journalists and also for non-journalists, which we develop both in Guatemala and in foreign countries. I would like to show you a couple or a few examples of what we've done recently in different areas of corruption. First one is corporate corruptions, and these are not instances of technological investigations. These are instances of inside investigation, company investigation. The first one refers to the biggest rum company in Guatemala, or the biggest sugarcane plantation in Guatemala, which provides to the, or belongs to the two biggest rum companies in Guatemala. It's a story about how this company used a byproduct of the sugarcane as a fertilizer in their fields in order to ripen the sugarcane and make it grow faster, but with the unexpected consequence that this very product also ripened the fruits of the peasants all around the neighboring peasants before these fruits had grown. The company, the state knew that. They had conducted an investigation and they had shut up. So they had, the rum company had the consent of the state. Second investigation that has just happened. It's about how a palm tree company and some other industries had hijacked a river and dried it out, and how the community affected by it has recently liberated it. This one, it uses technology, it uses social science methodologies for analysis, mainly network analysis, and it's about patronage in the public sector. It took us 3 years to collect all the data. We gathered like 100,000 files for people. And we found out something that was unknown. Well, everybody knew, but not to what extent. The non-elected politicians were hired by their superiors after someone won the election. We mapped the executive power, the Congress, and some autonomous institutions, and we found out that 3%, more than 3% of non-elected politicians got hired after the elections. And that is even a small number because we left out all the information about the lower level administrative organizations like municipalities, town halls, etc. Because we couldn't get the information even though the law says we have to be provided with it. Next one. I'll just comment on the first investigation. It's about political party financiation. The system, the controlling system is so weak in Guatemala that everybody takes for granted that illegal investigation happens outside the system. The political parties have to deliver a statement about their financiation. Everybody takes for granted that illegal financiation won't be there, even though it appears everywhere. It won't be in the public statement. Well, we did some network analysis and we found out that the leading party in the last elections was stating 20 companies that were giving them financiation. What we found out was that 50% of all the money they did they show in this statement was in the end came in the end from the very same company, even though it was split in 10 or 20. The law only allows 5% from the same source. So 50% came, and it was plainly stated in public papers. Just to find out to finish. So the next one. Okay. No, I'll just finish there. As a news outlet, what we can do, what we are ethically allowed to do, has a lot of restrictions and it has a lot of limitations. But Luis Ortiz, to my right, from Nueva Mexico, is going to tell us where citizen activism can reach.
Thank you, Enrique. Well, in terms of the things that we are able to do, and how as citizens, as activists, and as civic technologists, the spectrum is very different from what my colleagues have described, and yet it is not as simple, as safe, as deprived of risk as one might think. The concept of making corruption backfire, I borrowed it from a dear friend, and a shout out on Periscope to all the gang of Canvas and Sergio Popovich, who always talks about making corruption backfire as a way of applying Gene Sharp's theory of the political jiu-jitsu. So that means whenever they're firing at you with all they've got, as citizens we are, and there are very interesting tools to make it backfire and make it go against them. I'm going to give you a few examples, and so maybe you're going to start, those faces are going to start smiling a bit more. The first concept I want to talk about is, if you want to go to the next one, Kara, I can speed this up. Laugh activism. Laugh activism is a very old concept. It is a very old and traditional and yet very effective concept. If you want to follow Supercívicos right now, you make them a big favor. They're fundraising as we speak on Fundeadora, and they're doing everything they can to get money to fund their army. They have an army of citizens that are documenting cases of lack of access to public services, lack of access to public spaces, corruption, as well as many other funky dealings that government officials, as well as corporations and even public officials, are going through. They have a set of videos that are really sensational in terms of the humor. They're trying to expand and get out of Mexico City and try to find a bit of other spaces around the country, because my country is pretty big, but yet Mexico City seems to be this huge mole that we cannot get rid of. But Supercívicos are showing us something that's important. Laughing doesn't mean that you're trivializing. Laughing doesn't mean that you're making things ironic. But laughing is one of the most potent tools that the powerless can have to make somebody very, very upset. And I challenge you, whenever somebody's being extremely unfair, or extremely ungrateful, or extremely nasty to you, just turn around and laugh. In my country, you need at least 100 meters so that the person cannot reach you with their fist. But that's something that I suggest you try, and you tell me how it goes. Supercívicos, at Supercívicos MX, please follow them. They're going to be super, super happy, and everybody's following right now. Arne, good old Arnie. Arnie ran for a set of office positions around in the city as well, unfortunately. And he ran for the, I don't want to say unfortunately, he ran for the PAN, for the political right, the right-wing party. And yet, Arnie didn't make it as an elected official. He's not very charismatic, he doesn't present well, and he's too much of an academic. However, Arnie does something very well. He periscopes like there's no tomorrow. And Arnie has been appointed by Xochitl Gálvez, who happens to be another controversial character. Xochitl appoints him as city manager of the turf where Xochitl is the delegada. She is the mayor of a small part of Mexico City. And Arnie, as a city manager, has two projects. One is Vecino Gandaya, and the other one is Vecino Cochino. Vecino Gandaya means the one that's taken advantage of things. And Vecino Cochino is the dirty, the nasty one. And so you'll see Arnie chasing middle-class women who are opening the window of their SUVs and throwing the bags of garbage. And Arnie will be on a mountain bike with a periscope saying, señora, se le cayó la basura, you dropped that thing. What this is doing, and I'd like to hear the opinion of my colleagues up here, it's generating a very interesting debate in the Mexican polity, and something that we haven't had before, which is a lot of the alleged criminals or women who are, or men who are parking their cars in funky ways are claiming is that it is a slight infringement of their privacy space. Which might be true. I'm periscoping and I have the camera on your face. But on the other hand, naming and shaming is also a very old technique to make people own their actions. Say, okay, you park illegally, okay, you'll get a fine, go home and learn how to park. And yet, it seems that in our society, and this is something that my husband always says, there seems to be no reason for people to own, and there is no consequence for people's actions. Next one is a darling of the anti-corruption and the transparency, La Ley 3 de 3, if you want to get into that. Transparency International, their Mexico chapter, and IMCO, at Juan Pardinas, its amazing director, started this initiative. It's very simple. Public officials, tell us how much you make, tell us what you have, and from now on, we're going to commit to be good people, period. It's a big deal. 396 to the day when we made the presentation had signed it. It's a big deal. Get in there, it's fun, it's very interesting, and they're geo-mapping. And the last one, just because it's my comadres and they're phenomenal. The women on top are las estereotipas. Sambuca and Catalina Por Dios, a Mexican-Colombian duo who are doing really, I'm telling you, they're the next John Oliverinas of the scene. Go on YouTube, look at estereotipas, and particularly their La Ley del Garrafón. They're trying to denounce machismo and denounce sexismo and denounce the way women are stereotyped by performing sketches that are extremely fun and yet very, very strong. And the other ones are Chicas Poderosas. Chicas Poderosas is an initiative from ICFJ, the Knight Foundation, as well as a bunch of us. 8 countries already now of women who are trying to make groups of women who to help professionals in the newsroom, in tech companies, as well as in civic technology spaces to feel more empowered to use technology. So follow Chicas Poderosas, follow Estereotipas. I'm going to give the mic to Kara to come to the conclusion of all this mix of opinions that you've heard, and then I'll get back for the last part. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lou. So I want to get to the Q&A because that's like the fun part. I tend to kind of straddle the fence between the journalism side and also the theory side, and I always find like there's nothing as grounding as a good theory. And so one of the things that I've been looking at is like the use of Lessig's theory of the things, like what he calls the 4 modalities. And modality is just like, different things that impact our behaviors, right? Different modes that impact our behaviors. And so he breaks it down into 4 different components and has to do with laws, things that are enforceable, that we, if you go over 65 miles per hour, actually, is there still 65 miles per hour? Anyway, so actually there is enrichment. So if you go over like a certain speed limit, you would get ticketed, right? So obviously like that's one way that our behavior is modified right away. There are market incentives for how we behave because there are certain things that will give us like financial incentives for us to use like certain technologies or behave in certain ways. Norms, there's a big factor like in how our peers see us and how our behavior is shaped by what we think is cool or like what our peers think like is the way to do things. And so that's a really, that also governs like how we behave. Not necessarily, it's not like a penalty kind of, type of thing, but it is that socialization aspect. And then the last one is architecture and how things are designed. Like, this is probably something you deal with every day. It's like, when the steps of any place that you go to are not spaced out properly, you're like, God,
the steps are just terrible. Like there's a lot of things are just poorly designed that impact us and also shape the way that we move about in the world. And so I kind of want to give you that framework as a way to think about, like, when you're looking at the use of technologies, or you're looking at the use of different types of approaches, because it's not just innovation isn't just in the digital technology that we use, it's also in the way that different approaches that we might have around the use of the technology. And so I want to end this on a high note, because I think there are some really great things happening in Latin America right now that I hope are a sign of more things to come along this angle. But one of the things is in Brazil, in terms of the policy aspect, Brazil passed the Marco Civil of the internet, which forbids bundling of connection logs. And so when you think about like things like WhatsApp and what they call over-the-top messaging services, Brazil is very explicit with this new law about what the telecom companies can do with those logs and how long they can keep them. And so that's really important. And in DF, Mexico City, in 2015, just not too long ago, they set out 13 principles of data privacy to promote transparency, and so how data is actually being used. And so, that's just two examples. There's a lot more, and so I think, like, when you start thinking about like how governments can also support citizens and the work and getting more citizen engagement and participation. As Obama said, it is hard work to be a citizen, and so I think it does require a lot of multiple approaches for supporting citizens in the whole exercise of self-governance. And so with that, we'll open it up to, wait, actually, this is your meeting. We have to leave you with this because humor is important, right?
Karen was asking me, how can we make this graph of something a bit more appealing? So I just said, well, a meme is a form of communicating interesting ideas that can be danced in a humorous way. And by the way, that's Leo, and he just won an Oscar, and the movie was directed by a Mexican, so there you go. There's a humor in there.
And the film is Wolf of Wall Street, that's where it's from. Okay, so open that up, questions and answers. Oh, and we have some special prizes, Lou.
Ask a question, get a t-shirt.
Wow.
It's an octopus.
Incentives, right?
It's fun. It's a fun octopus. It's really great.
Great, thank you. So we have about 22 minutes of questions, and there's a microphone there.
I'll go first.
Hello, thank you. Hello? Okay. My name is Trevor. I lived in Oaxaca, Mexico for about 2 years. It's close to Guatemala. And so the question I have is specifically in Mexico. You made the point about you were able to get to, it was a sitting governor and a former governor tried in front of the Supreme Court. So my question is there a particular branch of the government or part of the government, whether local or state or federal, where there's no corruption or minimalized corruption? Like, how do you even know the Supreme Court, for example, is going to try these people?
Thanks for reminding me that I'd never finished that line of thought. The case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court threw the case out, saying that the evidence that was obtained because in a way that violated the privacy of the individual involved, and so on a technicality, it threw the case out. So what I was trying to make the point was that whistleblowing has a huge impact on cases getting known and moving through the arms of justice, if you will. In this case, injustice and impunity ruled the day, which is why we as an organization took a step back and said, look, one-off cases, right, using whistleblowers in a non-systematic way, probably is going to end in something like that. They're going to dismiss it as a fluke, right? Kind of like the James Rising case. But if you go and do several more significant cases in a successive way with other journalism partners where you can mutually validate each other in the public eye and have, once again, successive stories on issues around corruption at all different levels, that's what we're looking for doing, is basically having whistleblowing create a wave of citizen journalism, investigative journalism, that puts out there in such a constant way, on a constant basis, and allows more whistleblowers, if you will, using secure and anonymous technology to come forward and blow the whistle, that I don't think is per se a level of government that's better or not. It's simply, or state or municipality, for example, but simply the idea that we need to create this wave of evidence and this wave of cases on behalf of citizen journalists and just keep it in the public eye. And we see our job is doing that.
I think you're in a t-shirt.
It's gonna be serious.
Okay. Thank
Thank
No,
you.
no press.
Okay, is this thing on? I think it's on, right? Well, first of all, I have to commend you guys for the work that you do. I know Cara, and I became familiar with a lot of this stuff through her reporting. So I know it's risky, and I know it entails a lot of danger, I'm sure, on some of your parts. And so I commend you because I was curious when you were talking if you could speak to some of the challenges maybe your own organizations have come across in doing this work. Because, I mean, when you're in the shadow, no one likes it when you cast light on them. So I'm wondering if through Mexico WikiLeaks or through your publication in Guatemala, if you've received harassment, threats, and how that's come back on you, really. And feel free to throw out the shirt.
Hey, wait, you already got his shirt.
I want 2 shirts.
Somebody's gonna have to work out the sizes. Can you help me?
You gotta, you
It was part of a joke, but I'll take it.
This is her stuff.
Gracias.
Well, there are many challenges in many areas in our organizations. First of all, human resources. It's not that easy to get the people we need to do the job we do. Second, financial resources. You know the crisis that we are all experiencing, and even though we belong to a university, and 2/3 of our budget comes from the university and is granted. In order to grow bigger, we need funding. And regarding security issues, well, I wouldn't say that we are the most affected outlet in Guatemala. We are quite protected by the fact that we work inside the university. All our information is quite protected by that very fact. Physically, we are protected by that very fact. Our biggest weaknesses are that we are about 15 people working in Plaza Pública, and 6 to 10 people work at home most of the time. Their connection to internet, their homes, our homes are not that protected. And but that's not even the main risk. The main risk is that we don't cover the government's agenda. We don't cover the economic power agenda. So we are not shepherded by their agenda. We don't share the same room with other journalists. All that we do it alone. We do it by ourselves. So we do a lot of work on the ground outside the capital city of Guatemala, and when we experience the biggest risk is when we are outside. We try to minimize that risk by keeping in contact constantly, by having checkpoints, by sending 2 or 3 people every time, which makes it coast clear, by educating ourselves in security techniques, physical security techniques, technological security techniques. But risk is something you have to live with. You cannot. You can do a lot of analysis. You can do. You can prevent, but you cannot deter risk at all.
I will speak quickly about digital security, and then you want to talk about activism at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. So clearly, Mexico after Iraq is the worst country on earth for journalism, right? In terms of the safety and insecurity that the risks that journalists face. Murders are the order of the day for journalists. Recently, Mexico City, a prominent journalist, photojournalist, was killed. So it's not just the states of Mexico or the quote-unquote narco areas of Mexico, but it's the whole country. Which is why Mexico Leaks, for example, all the journalism that we do through an arm's length transaction, right? We do not know ever the identity of the source. That's to protect the source, but it's also to protect us. If the authorities or the powers that be thought that we had information about the source, well, that would be more reason for them to come after the journalists. In the case of Mexico Leaks, none of the journalism organizations for a Mexico Leaks case yet, knock on wood, have had problems with security in this regard, though all of us have had insecurity problems doing other stories and other cases. I think I just want to say that, you know, the key for us is thinking that the hacking team, when it was revealed last year that Mexico was first or second, I don't recall, maybe it was first, of the countries that spend the most money on private digital espionage of its citizens, of its journalists, of its NGOs, you know, that gave us all a very clear signal that we have to use, you know, once again, the best encryption technology possible. So, for example, we use only PGP, anonymous Tor browsing, Signal every time we do, you know, messaging, you know, no Gmail, no Hotmail, no Facebook Messenger, none of that, because that's the stuff the hacking team is really infiltrating the most. So, and we take it very seriously. We realize that you can't have a successful journalism platform like Mexico Leaks if you cannot guarantee the security on both ends of the spectrum.
In terms of the activist community, the risk is higher since a citizen journalist, a citizen reporter, an activist, or a person who is trying to speak up for something that is happening in the closed space, by definition, will not be in an organization, and henceforth the risk is higher. That said, I don't even want to start talking about gender-based violence as well as hate crimes, etc., etc. It is not easy to be in Mexico right now. It is not easy to be involved in social change in Mexico right now, and in Guatemala, same. That said, I don't believe this is a time to complain, to worry, or to be concerned. This is a time for action. And this is why we're here. Because we want to convey the message that technology is empowering us to work safer, faster, better, and be more effective. But we definitely need more people to know what we're doing. And we definitely need more people to look south of the border and hang out with us more. I believe that would be the message. We are in danger, definitely, and you guys are too. Everybody is when one decides to take the banner of social change in their hands. But that doesn't mean that we are alone. The network is the important part. That's what I would put on the table. Networks of journalists, networks of activists, networks of human rights defenders. The network failed in Honduras last week. We lost Berta. And the network fails every now and then, and people go through the net. But we are not alone, and we know that, and you guys are not alone either.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more questions. Oh wait, t-shirt. Did we give our t-shirt? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, go ahead. We're gonna make sure we have enough t-shirts.
It's okay. Hi, thank you for sharing these projects. I'm particularly interested by the one that you have mentioned over WhatsApp, and I was wondering if any of you have any more examples of initiatives that have being initiated through mobile technology, mobile apps, and that's all. And any other example that you guys can share?
Yeah, actually, you mean in terms of like the ones that present risks, or?
No, in general.
Okay, well, I can speak about mobile. So there's a really great report card that Electronic Frontier Foundation, UFF scorecard, I think it's, yes, yeah, scorecard. If you haven't seen this, it's one of those things where you're just gonna like you're gonna end up taking all your messaging apps off your phone. Because here it is, right? So they, Electronic Frontier Foundation, based in San Francisco, they did this incredible scorecard, and what they did is they went through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 main questions that had to do with digital security, end-to-end encryption, whether the actual, the message is encrypted itself, like who sends all this information, right? And so you could see, and they did different messaging services. So they've got CryptoCat and Facebook chat. So obviously, green means it's good, and red means it's not so secure, right? So if you've been using WhatsApp, let's go down to WhatsApp right now. It doesn't do well on the scorecard.
Because it shouldn't be the space when one should start doing this type of projects. So maybe your question should be answered by yes, we have a lot of examples, but it is not necessarily the safest space anymore.
Did everybody hear what Lou said? In the back, okay. So, I mean, the biggest thing is like you have to really, someone that I know, one of my friends who teaches at Planned Parenthood, she always said, you know, being on the internet is kind of like once you start having sex, like it's, you know, if you want to be 100% safe from anything, you abstain, right? And so that's not necessarily an option in terms of like our online use, but like once you're out there online, it really is a harm reduction game, right? And so there is no one app that is going to keep you 100% safe. What these apps are doing and what the different, like encryption and things like that do is they create barriers. They make it difficult for someone to intercept the message, to hack into someone's account, but it's never going to be 100% safe. And so I know, for example, with Berta Cáceres and a lot of the frontline defenders in Honduras, when we were doing the Nobel Women's Initiative and gathering different testimonials of women who had been impacted by violence, Berta was one of the people that was not using a cell phone. She would turn off her cell phone whenever she was doing a lot of her organizing activities, and so she was already doing a lot of harm reduction strategies and a lot of other things to help reduce her risk, but in the end, I mean, it was very risky what she was doing. So I hope this helps. There's a lot of different scorecards like this, but I find this to be the most useful. And the methodology, it actually breaks down what each of these questions is and like what it means. And when you talk about financial incentives or market incentives, really, the people who really have a lot of power is the customer, right? So if you start demanding that your applications and your technologies do have a certain level of security, like the market will respond. And I think this is where it also comes down to all of you demanding this level of security as well, based on being informed about what's putting you at risk. Okay, last two questions. Wait, did we do the t-shirt? Or are we going to do it later?
It's gonna happen. So here's going. Does someone catch it over there? Great.
Okay, very good. Great. Last two questions.
I had a question going to the human trafficking issue, because we've seen like kind of a pretty huge tidal shift in the United States, where this used to be a very underground issue, people were really ignoring it, and then they started acknowledging the international issue, but they were kind of ignoring domestic victims, and you've seen this huge change to where now we're actually seeing progress in government with police officers, you know, which originally had just kind of started with nonprofits and everything, and now victims are starting to feel safe telling their stories. Can you speak to like what you're seeing in Mexico and Guatemala in terms of like where is the progress being made? Are you seeing it in governments and police forces at all, or are victims feeling like they can come forward and be safe telling their stories?
Great.
Shall we take the last one?
Sure, and then the second question.
Hi there. I just got back from working in Greece with the refugees there, and I work for a maternal health organization where we are dealing with issues of trafficking as well and sexual gender-based violence. And I'm wondering how transferable your platforms are outside of Guatemala and Mexico, and how confident you are in how like universal they may be, or if they're more of like a regional based like for the issue that you especially are dealing with.
We have 2 t-shirts to fly. Hi.
Okay, so first question on victims and their stories.
You were talking about the Red MSP, and maybe it will be interesting.
So I would say just to answer the last question in a way of segueing the first question, the basic technology behind the whistleblowing platforms that we use, which are not dissimilar from PubLeaks, for example, which is the technology used in Holland, or AfriLeaks, which is the one that now exists in Africa, it's called Global Leaks, the Global Leak open source software. We've modified it and we put, I would say, heavier encryption on both ends, but nevertheless, it's a very transferable system. There's a system in the Mediterranean countries, actually. I don't know if it's in Greece yet, but certainly in Italy and Spain, and making its way across the region, which is called Filtra.la. It's a filtra.la, and basically it's a technology that adapts global leaking software for those countries to be able to create platforms, not just for journalists, but actually for NGOs, for aid organizations, and so on, to basically create a platform for victims' voices. And then I would say on the human trafficking issue, unfortunately, the short answer is no. I don't think that at a great levels, at least in Mexico, I can't speak for Guatemala, that for victims of human trafficking, there's a trust in any sort of government mechanism to bring your voice forward. Kind of back to my point earlier, until there's secure and anonymous, protected, independent, arm's length transactions that the government can facilitate and secure and guarantee people's anonymity if they choose, and certainly their security, I don't think people are going to trust those law enforcement agencies to blow the whistle.
With regards to the question on I'm hoping that I understood this question correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. The increasing tendency of victims to tell their stories and to expect some kind of maybe safety from that story sharing. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. I'll tell you, that's one of the questions I asked Miguel Angel. One of the first questions is I said, well, why are you telling me the story? Why are you exposing yourself constantly, right? And he said that was the only way that people were going to get it, and that he was willing to take the risk to get. And that actually one of the things that he agreed with me for me to do the ride along with him is he said, I know that I'm going to be dead very soon, and I need you to get the story out to a bigger audience. Yeah, and he said WhatsApp is only going to get me so far, and so I think it's really there's this sense, and I think this is where it's difficult with the technology because there's the way that these technologies are designed, and we form like a group of friends. We think, well, that's safe because it's my group of friends, and I think there's a real misperception that the design of the technology is kind of like what we would have in a small room with our friends, that whatever is said there is going to stay there. And the design is actually quite different with the technology because it's quite easy to intercept these conversations. It's quite easy for eavesdropping, for all kinds of things, right? And so I do think there is a really, we have a couple of friends who do this kind of work, especially Luisa and I, and some of our work involves just kind of raising awareness about how much risk people are willing to take. And so I think there is a really big element of like, look, you can take this risk, but you need to also know what the risk is that you're taking in telling your story, because just telling your story isn't going to keep you safe from what would normally be the dangers that most people would face, right? With the use of these technologies, they're being on the internet. So I always, even with the pictures that you saw with the video of the guy saying, they did pay me, they paid me 300 pesos. I asked him, I said, Miguel Angel recorded this. I'm going to be using this. If I would like to use this video, it's going to go out everywhere. Are you okay with that? I need you to understand that anyone's going to be able to know what your name is. Anyone's going to be able, and he said, yes, I understand the risk. And he gave me that permission, and that's why I use it. But I was very clear about it, that he needed to know, and he needed to be informed, and he needed to make that decision in the end about his story. So, Lou, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, or maybe Enrique, with their work in Guatemala recently with the vicios.
I'll take that question in a much broader sense. I don't know if you've heard of the Guatemalan Spring last year. Well, last year there was this crisis of migrant children who came along on their own to the United States, and that was the phenomenon that sparked all that happened last year in Guatemala, probably in El Salvador, and probably in Honduras. What I mean is this: the United States government saw the depth of this crisis and all that it meant to us, the regional and the Central American countries. And the US government took action through their embassies, through your embassies in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador. What you saw, what we call the Guatemalan Spring, which is not a spring at all, or at least it's a spring superseded by winter but then comes the spring again, don't worry. Was a bunch of actions backed by the US government, by the US embassy in Guatemala, which led to the overthrow of the president, of the vice president, who are now in jail. So yeah, it's a big deal. This phenomenon you were talking about, it's a big deal, and it has led the US States, the United States, to action, and it has great consequences on our countries. You know, there is a UN commission whose purpose is to fight impunity in our countries, and that UN commission used to be backed by the European countries. It is still, but now the main funding comes from the US, and the UN commission has changed totally its strategy, diametrically its strategy. Before, it wasn't centered on transparency or corruption. Now it is. Because I think the United States Embassy thinks that corruption is the main issue in Guatemala, or perhaps not the main issue, is the issue that they can control. Besides that, you've probably heard of the Alliance for Prosperity, a plan of the United States for Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. If you go to Guatemala, you will notice that Alliance for Prosperity, or the Plan for Prosperity, which is the US plan for Guatemala, is the main plan of the current government. They don't have any other plan for prosperity, so a US plan is the main plan for our government.
I think we have to go. They're going to kick us out any minute. So I'm just going to say one thing. Technology is definitely adaptable because it is technology. But that doesn't mean that we don't